Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Arizona Historical Society's History is Happening Now, Socially Distanced Oral Histories. We're just gonna kind of slowly go into this as we're just right at our start time and we might still have a few stragglers who join our meeting here. So just a couple of orders of business first. We are going to ask that everyone who is not a presenter remains muted throughout the presentations. This will make it easier for our presenters today to have the floor, and they will be happy to answer any questions. And we do ask that you put your questions in the chat feature. Again, this just helps us keep orderly. These virtual meetings are a little harder to pinpoint and ask people to have speak questions. So if you can just put your questions, any questions you have in the chat, depending on where your what your Zoom meeting client looks like, that might be at the top or the bottom of your screen, but just please feel free to send us questions at any time. And so just like I said, a couple introductory items here. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm Rachel Black. I'm an archivist here at the Arizona Historical Society at the Arizona History Museum in Tucson. We have our presenters today are Jennifer and Perri. Jennifer are both archivists here at AHS. Jennifer is based out of our Tempe branch, and Perri is based out of our Tucson branch. Let's get through this and we will, hang on just 1 second. All right, so just another, again, a reminder, we are gonna ask that you remain muted. You're welcome to have your camera on or off, it's up to you. And a couple other things as we go through this, if you look for up at kind of the top of the screen, you might want to enable the speaker view. That way you don't see everybody at once, you'll just see who's talking. Up to you, however you want to set it up. So again, this is a presentation from the Arizona Historical Society. I'm sure most everyone here is familiar with us. Our mission here at the Society is connecting people through the power of Arizona's history. And we feel that oral histories and empowering people to collect oral histories on their own is a big part of this mission. Just a little bit about our background. We were established as by an act of the First Territorial Legislature in 1864. We're the oldest historical agency in the state. We have museums throughout the state, from all the way up north in Flagstaff and all the way down south to Yuma. We encourage you to visit us when the time is right and it's safe to do so. And you're welcome to keep an eye out on our website or sign up for our newsletter to get the most up-to-date information on when we do reopen our museums. In the meantime, we encourage you to stay connected with us. A couple ways to do that. We have Facebook pages, Instagram pages, Twitter pages. We also have our website where you can sign up for a newsletter. We also have a nice new, we call it the Digital History Hub, where we've got a set of really nice detailed information about different, there's some digital exhibits, there's activities for students, adults can do them too. I've done some of them, they're pretty fun. Lesson plans if you're looking for things for kids to do over the summer. So we encourage you to poke around our website and see what you can find there. And we really couldn't do the work that we do without your support. And again, we encourage you to visit our webpage and see how you can support more programming like this. some of the ways you can do that is membership. That's one of the best ways to be informed about what's happening in the society. You get notifications about programs like this, upcoming events, items coming into our new collections. You'll get a lead on new programs and our openings. You also get some other perks like free admission to all of our museums, discounts at the gift shops, and a subscription to the Journal of Arizona History. This is a quarterly journal that we have been publishing for 60 years now. We send it out to members. They get a hard copy of it in the mail every quarter. And the other perk for members is you also get access to the back issues for the last 60 years of the journal, available digitally. And a new way to support the society coming soon is we have a new, next time you go to register your vehicle, you can get a special commemorative Arizona Historical Society license plate. Sales from this license plate go towards benefiting the work that we do here at Arizona Historical Society. It helps promote exhibits, events like this, our in-person exhibits, and you can find out more information about that on our website as well as at the Department of Motor Vehicles website. All right, and that's really my introductory spiel. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to our presenters, Perri and Jen. You can go ahead and take it from here.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. As Rachel mentioned, if you can't see me talking right now or Jen, who's about to start talking, you can change up in the top, I think it's the right-hand corner of Zoom. You can change to speaker view so that the person who is speaking at the time, whether it's Jen or I, we're going to be taking turns and you'll be able to see us featured on your screen. Won't be just a voice from the void, Wizard of Oz. All right, so Jen, ready to get started? You're muted.
There we go. It helps if you can hear me too, doesn't it? Yeah, so like Rachel said, I am Jen Mary, and I am in our Tempe location, and Perri's down in our Tucson location. And we're here today to discuss the particulars of conducting an oral history when you can't be face-to-face. Today is Wednesday, July 29th. And as we said, we are also having this discussion from our respective locations. I'm in my house, actually, in Mesa, and Perri is down in Tucson.
We are properly socially distanced, quite. So for many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic has made us hyper aware of the distances that separate us from the people we care about. And for many of us, it's made us want to draw closer to the people in our lives. I, for one, have been to more Zoom events in the past 6 months than actual in-person events I've attended in my entire life, or at least that's what it feels like. But distance isn't exclusive to this pandemic. Many of us live far away from our families and friends and can't readily meet up with them in person. Now, the good news is that distance isn't a barrier to conducting oral histories anymore. The technology that we use every day makes these interviews easier than ever before. So conducting an oral history interview with a friend or family member is a way to not only learn more about their lives, but also capture those memories for future use by historians.
Perri's right. And, you know, usually when we think of oral histories, we first think about interviewing older family members. But with these barriers of the distance removed because of all these digital tools we have, we want to challenge you to think about going beyond that. What about interviewing, you know, say your teenage son, or maybe your college roommate, or, you know, you have a favorite barista down at Starbucks, Oral histories are really great ways to capture a variety of perspectives on history that happens every day, not just extraordinary events like what we're experiencing right now. So everybody has a story that they can tell, regardless of their age, their background, and future historians like us would really love to hear those.
Exactly. It's just as important to hear about the everyday lives that people live and to make sure we're taking the time now to record them. So, although we're thinking a lot about this right now, the tips we're about to share can be useful in any circumstance where you can't conduct an interview face-to-face, and even sometimes some of them when you can. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. No, wrong screen. Okay, so just a quick reminder to keep yourself muted throughout the presentation, just because Jen and I will be going back and forth. You can keep your camera on or off and direct all your questions to the chat so that we can address them in the Q&A portion. We'll have our Rachel and Isabel, our moderators, will be reading them out. Okay, Jen, let's talk a little about the tools you can use to record long distance interviews.
Okay, well, there's several options for recording a virtual oral history interview. They can be done audio only, with video, whatever you and the person you're interviewing is most comfortable with. So consider what equipment you have. For video call, you're going to need strong internet connection, reliable computers to support a long interview so that you don't have it freezing up or getting cut off. Make sure your computer works well with what you're doing. The other thing to remember is even if you can't do a video, the most important part is that the audio is good. The story, that's the core of the interview. So making sure that the audio is clear should be your first priority. If you can get a video, that's also great, but you want really sound good audio.
Right. So if you do decide to do a video interview, many of the popular conferencing programs like Zoom allow you to record your virtual meetings, like this one we're having today. Most of these programs will save your video files in a commonly used format, which is necessary to ensure they are preservable over the long term. Now, okay, there's a whole lot that can be said about the quality of various types of file formats and their lifespan, but in the interest of time right now, I'll just say that if you decide to use a conferencing platform to record a video interview, check beforehand to see what format your file will be saved in. The various programs will, if you look in their Q&A and like their FAQ sections, they'll tell you what the file format's going to be saved in. Now, you're gonna wanna make sure that it will save your video file as either an MP4 or an MOV file. Those are both formats that are widely used, and they don't lower the quality of your recording too much when they save. If it says the file will be saved in a format you've never heard of before, or one that requires a particular program to open, like WMV Windows Media video files, you're gonna wanna choose a different platform because that's not a great file format for accessibility purposes and for long-term preservation. So Zoom, as you can see on my screen in this example, it saves your video file as an MP4, which is a decent quality format for saving files in the long term.
So if you opt to do an interview with only the audio and no video, you're going to get a higher quality if you bypass the computer completely and just use your smartphone. You could technically still do a phone call through Zoom, which some of you might be doing tonight, and you could have the camera turned off. But there's a lot of different apps that will give you a much higher quality recording, depending on the type of phone that you have. So you want to search around to find an app that's going to fit your needs. So for like an Apple phone, you would go to the Apple App Store. If you have a Google phone, I think they have an app store too. You just want to see what's going to work with the phone that you have. You also will probably have to pay for an app. Most of the free ones don't have a length limit, or most of them will have a length limit, and you don't want to have to cut your call short because it couldn't record all of it. So you want to check that as well for any of those free apps. So whether you use an app or if you go through a cloud service or a Zoom service, the most important thing to verify, like Perri said, is that it's saved in a proper format, and what you're looking for is the WAV format, .wav. MP3s are not good enough quality for an audio file to save reliably over time. You know, as Perri also mentioned, there's a lot that we could talk about with file types and long-term storage. These are just a few of the examples. We can talk more in the questions. If you have more specific questions you want to talk about, throw those in the chat box, and we'll talk about it during the Q&A session.
Yeah, and one other thing to be aware of is that the longer the interview goes, the bigger your file is going to be. So you need to make sure you plan in advance to have somewhere to store it. The Oral History Association recommends that you budget 1 gigabyte for each hour of audio and up to 30 gigs for an hour of video. In my opinion, that's a little bit of an overestimation because it varies widely depending on your settings and the way you choose to do the recording. But the idea is clear that you want to have plenty of space available for saving your file. There would be nothing worse than getting to the end of your recording and then having it not be able to save because of storage. Your computer will need to have enough free space to save the file there at first, and then you'll want to transfer a copy of it to an external hard drive or a cloud-based service for safekeeping. When you use Zoom, as you can see on my screen, the recording will automatically convert at the end and save once you end the meeting.
So this is a lot of technical information that we just gave you. How can we be sure, Perri, that it's all going to work right before the actual interview?
Yeah, so this is one of several reasons why you should do a test run with your interviewee before you actually start recording. Set a time in advance where you can practice getting everything set up correctly with the sound and the video, making sure your mics are turned on correctly, etc. This will give you both a chance to get comfortable with the technology, and it can be particularly challenging if the person you're interviewing isn't very tech savvy. So this is a way for you to both express any concerns you have and decide if you need to choose another platform before the day of the interview. As Jen mentioned earlier, you want to get the highest quality recording possible. So make sure that both you and the person you're interviewing have a quiet space to talk without background noise or interruptions. I will segue really quick to tell a story about how I once conducted an oral history interview with someone who ended up having construction done at their house during the interview. And we kept having to stop and start it, and it ended up, the recording was completely useless by the end. I just had my notes to go by. Now, if I had clarified this in advance, I would have chosen a different location, but you live and you learn. And now I know it's important to clarify all of this before the day of the interview. So speaking of sound quality, you may also want to invest in a microphone or headphones if you aren't getting the quality you're looking for in your test run. Speaking of sound quality though, Jen, what are your thoughts on interviewing more than one person at a time? Should I talk to both my grandma and my grandpa together so I can hear both of their stories?
Well, it's true that sometimes oral histories are done with more than one person or in a group. It's a lot easier to interview just one person at a time, especially if you're interviewing them over the phone. People tend to chime in on one another's stories, talk over one another, and when there's a lot of voices and you're trying to record, words get muffled, you can't hear them, things get lost in the shuffle. You can always use the stories that you get from one person and then interview the other. You're going to be really surprised at how grandma's story is different from grandpa's, and it's the same story. So that also adds a lot of nuance to what you're doing.
Yeah, there is a reason why we're taking turns today and not, trying to chime in with each other so we get a good quality recording. So while you're doing your test run of the technology, also use that time to explain to the person you're interviewing, what is your vision for the interview? What do you want to gain from it? Who do you think might be interested in this interview? How you're going to ask your questions, and also any paperwork you need. This is also an opportunity for them to fill you in on any subjects that maybe they don't want to talk about, which will help you in preparing your questions and avoiding touchy subjects that might make them uncomfortable.
Yes, so you mentioned paperwork, and we should really talk about that. What kind of paperwork do you need to have signed to conduct an oral history with someone, and why would you even need paperwork to begin with?
Okay, Jen, this is hands down the most important part of this workshop, so we're going to spend a little time on it. There are a lot of details, so I want you all to know that we'll be including this on a handout you can access on our website once this recording is made available. So before conducting any type of oral history interview, even with your best friend or your grandma, you need to have them sign a form that outlines the terms between you and them, the interviewer and the interviewee. Now, it doesn't have to be overly legalistic or wordy, but there are 3 key parts to include: an interview agreement, a copyright statement, and a statement about future use of the interview. We will go into now. So first, the interview agreement is just a simple statement granting permission to do the interview. For example, if this conversation between Jen and I was an oral history interview, ours would say, quote, "I, Perri Pyle, agree to be interviewed and recorded by Jennifer Shaffer Mary on July 29th, 2020. That's it, simple. Next, a copyright statement. So this is the part that legally transfers the ownership of the recorded interview to you, the interviewer. In this case, our agreement would say, quote, "Upon completion of this interview, I hereby grant to Jennifer Shaffer Mary the perpetual rights of use, reproduction, distribution, derivative works, performance, and display of this work for educational and research purposes." You can feel free to copy this statement verbatim or to look up other examples online, oral history copyright statements, but this is a basic copyright statement that you would include.
So basically what you're saying is that you've given me permission to use this interview today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, and that is the reproduction, the rights of use. And then you're saying I can sell it, which is distribution. I can make copies for library patrons, that would be the reproduction. I can take pieces of it and make mashups of sound bites for my next rap song. That would be derivative works and performance. And I can put this video up on my website or in our museum, and that would be the display. Is that sort of what you just said?
Yeah, that's basically to break it down. I know it sounds a little bit legalistic, but It's the next part is, we can talk about it more in the Q&A too, if any of this is unclear. But the next part actually expands on what you said at the end about using it online a little bit. So last, you're going to want to include a statement about the interview's future use. This will allow you and your interviewee to define any limitations to what you can do with the interview after you're done with it, like donate it to an archive, museum, or other repository. If the person you're interviewing has any restrictions they want to include, this is where you would include those. So in our example, I wouldn't want our interview to have any restrictions. So our agreement says, quote, I give permission for the recording to be deposited in an archive or repository and to be made publicly available without restrictions on its use. Now, some common restrictions that people might want include not wanting the interview to be publicly available until a certain date in the future or until after their death, or not wanting the interview to be put online. But, however, caveat, one thing to be aware of is that when it comes to the archive side of accepting donated interviews, the fewer restrictions, the more likely it is the archive will want to accept a donation. That's because we mostly want to accept items that we'll be able to make accessible right away. So if you can persuade your interviewee to not put any restrictions from the historical institution side, that is going to be better. But really, it's up to them, and we do need to respect their wishes on what they want to do with their interview. So just to wrap this part up, once your terms are outlined in this agreement, you will both sign and date it and store that document somewhere safe. You will need this paperwork if you do decide to donate it to an archive in the future. All right, so Jen, you've chosen a platform and you have your signed consent form. Is there anything else you should do before the day of the interview?
One last thing that's very important also, prepare a list of interview questions. The purpose of an oral history interview is to try and capture the personal account of someone's lived experiences, but the catch is that people have very rich and complex lives. So if you're sitting down to ask someone to share their entire life story, that's pretty much impossible. You could talk to someone for days and days and still only get the tip of the iceberg on all the things that they've experienced throughout their lives. So for that reason, it's really important for you as the interviewer to ask yourself questions like, what do I want to know? What do I want this interview to be for? Are you interviewing this person to gain gain insight into a historical event that they lived through, such as what we're living through right now? If so, then you want to focus on that time period. Or if you want to know what it's like being part of maybe a particular community, you would focus your questions on that goal. Preparing a list of maybe 10 questions in advance will give you material to keep the conversation flowing, but you also keep in mind that people's memories don't always come linearly and they're not always well organized. So there's going to be times when the person you're interviewing jumps to some kind of what you think is a random event or a time that you didn't know or you didn't plan for. So the most important thing in that event is to let them talk. You aren't ever really going to be able to follow a script, but if you have some questions prepared in advance, you can be guided through these moments when you're not sure what to ask next or there's an awkward pause.
Yeah, I think having done a bunch of oral histories myself, I think having a list helps me feel more prepared too. Like I've done my research, and it also helps me make sure that I don't get so caught up in their narrative that I forget to ask the one burning question that I really wanted answered.
Yes, there's nothing worse than having to call them back.
Wait, oh, I forgot something.
Exactly.
All right. Okay, so the fun part. I have a couple of additional thoughts to help you in preparing your questions and then actually asking them during the interview. The content of your questions, the specifics of what you ask them about, is really up to you and the relationship with the person you're interviewing and what you want to learn about them. But how you phrase the questions is important for everyone. So try not to ask questions that can be answered with a yes or no or a one-word answer. Rather, try to phrase everything as an open question. For example, instead of saying, Jen, where were you born?
Tucson.
Exactly, one-word answer, and it went nowhere. So instead of asking, Jen, where were you born? Say, could you tell me about where you were born? This will give the person more space to elaborate and to expand on what they think is most important about the question. I mean, they could talk about their family, their city, the year, really anything that they choose, and you'll end up getting a more rich interview out of it. Asking open questions also helps you avoid leading the conversation. So we don't always realize that we're leading the conversation, but it's really clear in our questions. It's where you inadvertently influence the kinds of answers you're hoping to get. So for example, if you start a question with, don't you think that Grandpa made the right choice? The person might find it harder to disagree with you or to give an alternative perspective. So instead, try asking, how did you feel about Grandpa's choice? It leaves your opinion as the interviewer out of it, and gives them the space to answer the question as they want to. This is also another reason why Jen and I said it's often better to interview one person at a time, because people tend to influence one another in telling their stories or change their tone depending on who's listening. If we have enough time in the Q&A, someone remind me to tell a story about interviewing a married couple. They've been married like 50 years. I have a good story for that.
Oh yeah, and another thing is to try to remember to embrace the silence. Perri, I know you and I talked about this being a challenge for both of us. So when you're interviewing, try not to feel rushed to fill a lull in the conversation with another question right away. Sometimes if you give people a chance to reflect, they'll think of more to add on to the previous question, or they might segue into another memory. When you give them a chance to go slow and reminisce, they have more time to think about their answers. You also want to make sure you aren't so laser focused on asking your questions that you forget to really listen to their answers.
Confession time. This is the hardest part for me. The hardest habit I've had to break in doing oral history interviews is feeling the need to let the person know that I'm listening by saying, uh-huh, oh, that's interesting, while they're talking and cutting them off. In regular conversation, maybe that's fine, but during an interview, especially a virtual one, where it's already hard enough to be clear and hear each other's voices, you might end up completely interrupting their train of thought or make it harder to hear their answers on the recording. The last thing I want is for my dumb comment to muffle over something important that they have to say. So I have to constantly remind myself to stay quiet and listen.
So basically, when in doubt, let the person you're interviewing take the lead.
Exactly. You want to be respectful and receptive of how they choose to tell their story and the way that they want to narrate it, the segues that they make. If they ask to stop the recording to take a break or say that they don't want to answer a certain question, it's okay to adjust the flow of your conversation. And it's also okay, sometimes we feel uncomfortable, but it's also okay to politely intervene if you notice they've gone so far off topic that it's not even really a lucrative conversation anymore. Like Jen said earlier, people can talk for hours and hours if given the space, and that's great, but also not very conducive to capturing stuff in an oral history recording. So just try to steer the conversation back by asking some more relevant questions. You can always request to do a follow-up interview if you realize there's something you missed that you really wanted to ask, or if you notice that they start to answer in less detail as they go on and get kind of fatigued and tired. But most importantly, and this is my #1 guideline for everyone, is to enjoy the moment. Oral histories can be so rewarding for both the person being interviewed, but also for the one doing the interviewing. You are not just a passive recipient of their story. If you think about it, your active engagement is what's giving their stories a platform in the first place.
So these are awesome tips, and I already feel better prepared for doing oral history interviews. Is there anything else we should know about the process?
Well, okay, one last and very important thing is to make sure you save not only the original interview recording, but also make multiple copies for safekeeping. A helpful term to remember is locks, L-O-C-K-S-S. Lots of copies keep stuff safe. Put them in multiple locations if you can, like on an external drive, on a friend's computer, or in the cloud, so that if anything happens to the first file, you have a backup and those memories are safe and sound. Also, if you have time to transcribe your interview, like listen to it and type out the dialogue, there are 2 main benefits to that. One is that after the interview's done, you can send the transcription to the person you interviewed and have them double check it, make sure they're okay with it before it goes out into the world. Double check their dates and their names and kind of, make adjustments as they need. You really want to get their approval as much as possible. And second is that, I'm going to do a little self-promotion here, is that the archivists who will receive that interview, that donated interview in the future, will be your biggest fans. Transcriptions make interviews much more accessible, and it's much easier to post a transcription online than an entire video or audio interview. There are also programs and apps that will transcribe audio and video for you. So, like, for example, you can upload any video or your interview to YouTube, and it'll automatically create captions for you. They're not going to be perfect because it doesn't pick up on every word. It's all machine generated, but you can go back after you have the transcript and make corrections as you're listening, and that's a lot easier than typing it all out yourself.
That's a good tip. We archivists do love oral histories. Those stories are just vital parts of the historical record, and they usually represent voices that aren't often captured in written documents. Anyone can tell their side of the story through these interviews and be reminded that their history is important too. Like we said in the title, history is happening now, and oral histories are one way that you can play a vital role in helping to preserve it. And now we left a lot of time for questions. So if you give us a minute, the moderators will start reading us the questions from the chat box, and we will answer as best as we can.
Much more fun to have a conversation than just for us to talk at you all day.
Exactly.
All right, so we do have quite a few questions. Just a few quick general questions. A question about, will we be recording and sharing this presentation? The answer is yes, we will be sharing the content from this presentation. It'll be on our digital history hub that we've mentioned a couple times before, so keep an eye out on that. Also, again, encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. So hopefully it'll be announced in that when it's ready and live for everyone to view. Another question about the photos in the background, and again, that lovely bar that Jennifer is at, where we can't go to bars, but Jennifer's at the bar. That's a Zoom background. That's a photo of I think it's the Congress Hall Saloon. from our collections here in Tucson, and we made that one as well as I think 3 or 4 others available for downloadable Zoom backgrounds. Again, you can download those on our website. So if you need to spice up your happy hours, we've got some fun things for you. All right, so we're just kind of gonna go in order of these questions, in order of what you, well, to start in order of what you covered. So some technical questions first. In regards to a file types, there was a note that you said MP3s are not a good enough file format, but is MP4 suitable for if you're recording it on a phone? For example, a phone can record 3 or more hours at a time using the free voice recorder app on like a Samsung, and that exports it as an MP4. Is that acceptable?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's different formats that are better. This is something that I'm going to include on the handout that I'm putting together that will go up next to this interview. That's going to include some resources like a guide to the best kinds of file formats for preservation purposes. But so actually the best kind of format that you can have for a video file, let's start with video, is either an MOV movie file or a AVI file. Then for audio, the best one really is a WAV file if you can have that. And then the next level down is an MP3 if you just absolutely must. But the reason is because of the way that it compresses the file, and it'll downgrade your quality. So really, when it comes to the digital preservation specialists, they have a hierarchy. It's not absolutely unsalvageable if you have like an MP3 or a lower quality format. It's just that it's not going to survive in the long term. It'll have to be converted or saved in different formats, because those files, they'll compress the quality when it saves and converts, and you'll end up losing like some of that audio, especially over time, as files have to keep getting migrated and updated and new forms of files come out. Does that clarify that a little bit?
And you also want to watch that you're not using anything that's some kind of proprietary software. We talked about the Windows, the WMVs, the Windows Media, Windows Movies that used to be around. Those are not great quality either, because you have to have that particular player. So you want to kind of stay away from any software that you have to have specific software to listen to or to play a video, because in 10 years that software may not exist anymore.
Absolutely. Digital files have a very short lifespan, which is why people tend to say, oh, why don't you just digitize everything? And I know that in an ideal world that would be great, but actually I took a great class in grad school where the professor wanted to scare all of us, and he said, the average lifespan of a digital file is 5 years. And so, I mean, that's a little bit, I have files going back like 20 years that I can still open on my computer, but in general, digital files are not going to last as long without a lot of care, and an archivist or whoever, specialist, making sure that everything is staying updated and that it's still open, like you can still open it in the programs we have. That's why sometimes, we've got microfilm and we've got cassettes that are slowly degrading over time, but so slowly in those physical formats. Digital files are a lot trickier. So you gotta be a little more careful. Try to get the best quality you can in the beginning if it's possible.
Yeah, so and then in that vein, if you do have a file in a lower quality MP3 audio file, is there anything that can be done to convert that to a better format?
I don't think so. I think it's because that's the format that it was captured in. I don't think there's much you can do to like upgrade the quality after you've already recorded it. You can always downgrade quality if you have like a really hefty file, like we do with our images, right? You have like a very hefty TIFF file and you can downgrade it to a JPEG, so it's a lot more easy to transfer and make accessible. But as far as I know, unless someone else knows, I don't think that you can like increase the quality afterwards. But you can save that MP3 very, very closely and just make sure that you're taking very good care of it and that you know, it's not going to get lost or have it be corrupted over time.
All right. And before we move on from file types, couple of questions about, well, one, here's a question from me. Nobody put this out yet, but in terms of identifying the best and most likely to last for the next 2 decades file types, are there places people can go to guide them?
Yeah, so sorry,
those?
Jen, to just keep talking over, but I had an amazing digital preservation professor in grad school. He's actually he's the head of digital preservation for the Library of Congress. And he's like 35, like, I don't know, he's like a wonder kid of digital preservation. But so the Library of Congress is at the forefront of digital preservation and knowing how to store those kinds of files. So they have a ton of resources. If you go to Library of Congress's website and type in digital preservation, they have like a task force and a digital preservation. They have books and articles and videos all on the topic. So I would recommend the Library of Congress for sure for finding out. You know, this leads me to another thought, which is that this stuff changes every single year. There's new kinds of file formats and there's new kinds of programs, which is kind of why Jen and I steered away from talking about specific programs or technologies that you can use other than Zoom, because I don't know about y'all, but I had never heard of Zoom before this year. And so now it's everywhere. Everybody's doing Zoom everything, which means next year it could be a new program. And so, yeah, so I would keep up to date through the Library of Congress and all the work that they're doing.
We could we could see if there's a specific handout that we can add to our links from the Library
Yes,
of Congress.
absolutely.
SAA, the Society for American Archivists, usually has some guidelines, and that's who we usually try to follow also. My best, just to kind of segue, my example of there's two really that have always stuck with me from my grad school experience, and that was, there's a story about the movie Toy Story 2, and that when that movie was being created, they only had one copy, and it lived on a server that actually died. And so they thought they lost the entire movie because somebody unplugged something they shouldn't have. However, there was a woman who had gone home on maternity leave and wanted to work on it. So she had a copy of it on her computer at her house. So that is the only reason that Toy Story 2 exists, is because somebody had. I don't know whether that story is true, but it stuck with me because it's a really great example of digital and how fragile it is. And if you think about however they created that movie or any digital media, if they create that on some kind of platform that exists only for Disney, no one else can use it. And that's what we mean by making sure all of these proprietary formats, when they come out, they don't always last. And so you just kind of really want to be careful with the quality. That it's not just quality, it's also longevity that we're worried about.
That actually reminds me of one more thing before we move on, is that just speaking of digital preservation, You might have noticed that I mentioned when I said to keep it somewhere safe and to make multiple copies, I mentioned the cloud or a cloud-based service, but I also said at your friend's house. Now, digital preservation experts, they tend to tell you, they will tell you, save your files on an external hard drive and ship them to someone in another part of the country, because if a hurricane comes and gets your part of the country, then it's safe over there. Cloud-based services work the same way, and in that it's in a different location. It's not tied to your physical computer. Although the danger, of course, with cloud-based services is because they can go out of business. Like, I can't remember what it was a few years ago, Snapfish or something had, which was a website where you could store all your photos, just went out of business one day and it was gone. And so, sometimes it's better to have multiple copies and keep them in different, as varied of locations as you can. So if something like that happens, your best friend has it on a tape across the country or whatever, and then you've got it. That's a great. Oh, the Toy Story, the story is true. That's wonderful. That's
I think
a wild story.
Well, the other thing that brings to mind is we also didn't talk about flash drives, and that's my second story. Is a mentor of mine would use the example of holding up a flash drive, dropping it, and stepping on it. You've just lost everything you had on that flash drive. They are not long-term storage devices.
Or you put them through the wash like I do all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Don't leave them in your pocket with your chopstick to go through the wash. Exactly. They're not long-term storage. That's the temporary, I need to take this file to work with me tomorrow. That's all that they are good for. You don't want to keep things on there that if you lose them, you've lost everything.
All right, so we're gonna transition a little bit here, still talking about kind of software tips and tricks. This is really about what do you do after you've got this audio recording? Is there any editing you should do of the recording? Are there apps that you recommend for editing recordings? Do you recommend editing recordings?
I have never edited a recording that I've done, mostly because I haven't needed to. The only that one interview I talked about where there was construction going on in the background, that one was just lost in general. There was just no point. I kept the transcript, but there was no point in keeping the file. But I've never edited because I'm wary of, it's kind of the same reason that archivists don't generally edit photographs. We don't really Photoshop our photos or change the colors or anything, because the original document is, and the original file in this case, is more important, I think, than trying to edit it. I don't know what kind of editing you would do either, what kind of editing you would need to do. I suppose perhaps if you finished your interview and you transcribed it, sent it back to the person, and they didn't approve, or they said, oh, that's not what I meant to say, I don't like how that makes me sound, and they really, really wanted to edit it in that way, like cut stuff out, you could do that. I still would rather not, and just kind of put a little footnote like they didn't want this part in here. But if it comes to getting their approval and wanting the interview to be able to do something with the interview beyond that, you could technically edit them. I wouldn't if you can help it.
It would just be a lot of work.
That too.
It's a lot of work, and
I mean, if you can maybe edit it and get the audio a little clearer or something like that, but you could also leave that to the future historian to mess with and do, or whoever wants to use it. It's personal choice, I suppose.
Well, and so here in Tucson, our local NPR station does an occasional they've been doing with the University of Arizona Libraries, the Archive Tucson project, and occasionally you'll hear snippets of those interviews on the radio, where I would say those aren't, I wouldn't call those edited interviews. They're a segment of an oral history interview where they still have the full recording. So would it be okay to take a segment of an oral history interview and just use that segment for something, and as long as you just save the raw file in its entirety for later?
Do you want to talk about the derivative works part? Because that's what that's really what the paperwork will, that's how you'll cover yourself with the paperwork by, that's why we included that line. And of course, if they do not want you to, and they will not agree to do the interview without you promising that it'll only ever be in its entirety, I like to include that line about derivative works so that because that covers you for taking clips.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. If you take a clip to do a mashup, or you take a clip to put in another interview or news article or something like that, those would all be derivative works, things that you used the original for and created something new out of. So you always want to kind of make sure you explain that to the person so that they understand that this is what they're agreeing to.
All right, one more quick question, two quick questions here, kind of specific questions. For transcriptions, are there any current transcription software platforms you recommend? And does anyone know of a program, a voice recognition program that does a good job of recognizing different and separating out different voices? So the problem is most voice recognition programs can't understand more than one speaker, so it puts the whole interview as one speaker rather than splitting out speaker one, speaker two. Is there any good transcription programs that can kind of handle some of those sticky issues that you know of?
Not that I know of off the top of my head, because I've never had to do that before, but I'll write that down as something to look up and include in our handout, just some resources. I'll see if I can find something. That's the problem with transcription services, and that's why I always use, even for my oral history interviews for, like published works that I've worked on, I've used YouTube, because it's just fast, it's easy, and you put the video up and then you can make it private so nobody else sees it and just get the transcription out of it. It kind of just, yeah, I'm not sure about any particular programs right now, because again, they change all the time, but I'll do some digging and see what I can find.
There's one that I have not used it, but it's a paid service too, so it's not free. But a lot of the newspapers use it. It's called, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Temi, T-E-M-I, and we'll put it on the handout. But that one I know a lot of people have used for transcription, and I've heard it's pretty good. Every one that I've tried, even apps on the phone, they're just mediocre at best. They just don't quite get the verbiage that you're using, and no matter how slowly you speak, it just doesn't pick up everything. So that's a tough one. I don't even use YouTube. I just do it by hand.
Well, you can always pay a college student, pay them right, but
Yeah.
Pay a college student. I paid undergrads to do mine when I was in grad school.
See, yeah.
Yeah, generally, no matter what service, what technology you use, there's really nothing better than your human ears for your brain for doing this. And then one final hardware-based question. If you find that your computer or your phone microphone just isn't cutting it, do you have any recommendations for external microfilms?
Oh, I don't off the top of my head again, but I do have a list. I already put it in the handout that we're putting together, just to kind of give modern, like 2020, the best ones that we can find. There's a couple of lists out there by oral historians, and I'll share that one as well. Make a note.
All right. So if there's any other questions on kind of hardware, software that we haven't answered, feel free to put them in the chat and we can always come back to them. But for now, we're gonna change gears and had a couple of questions about rights and agreements for you. So someone was wondering, why can't you just ask the person verbally on the recording to get their agreement? Why do you need to have them sign a piece of paper?
So I'll start if you don't mind, Jen.
Yeah.
The reason that it is better to get it signed is mostly for the future use of the file by an archive. An archive or a museum, they're going to want it signed and written. They don't know if that person has a gun to their head or something, like if somebody's forcing them. It's just better to cover all your bases and have a written signed agreement. I've never heard, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard of an archive or a university special collections that has accepted an oral history based only on a verbal agreement since it's coming from someone else. Now, if the paperwork that you do is really kind of to cover yourself if something happens to that person that you interviewed and they're not still around to do the future paperwork for an archive or a museum. So for example, I did all this paperwork when I was interviewing people for my master's thesis, and then when I donated the recordings to a different archive when I was done with the project, they wanted to contact them personally and have them fill out their own paperwork because they were still alive. I had them sign it because, just in case something happened to them, but it's really about having the legal terms. You can get consent for the recording. That first part where I wrote down, I agree to be recorded, you could potentially do that one in the recording, just have them say it out loud. But the stuff about copyright, you just want to cover yourself and make sure that's written down and signed.
Yeah, every attorney will probably tell you to have it in writing.
That also makes it so that you can give a copy of that agreement and what was decided to the person that you're interviewing. So
and their family, right? Their family will have that paperwork too if something happens to them and their family's like, wait, no, we don't have consent. You have, everybody's got a copy, all on the same page.
Right.
Yeah. So in talking about kind of drafting these agreements, you mentioned that it's best to get as few restrictions as you can, but if somebody says, I will only do this interview if you agree to have this restricted for, at least until I'm dead, or 50 years or 100 years after I'm dead, would you go forward with that interview, or what would you say? And I guess this is also sort of another angle to this, is if somebody is concerned about things that might be said or that they might say in this interview might anger other people, how would you address that?
Yeah, so people do sometimes want restrictions, right? And the most common one I've seen is don't put this interview anywhere until I'm dead, for whatever reason. Maybe they talk about people that they don't want to hear or something like that. But I would say that the decision to go forward with it is a personal one. If you're doing it for your grandpa and your cousin or something, and you really want to capture the family story, maybe in that case, I would still do it and hope that I would be able to pass that file down so that someone else, like after the restrictions passed, or to maybe you'll be able to find an archive that'll take it, even with restrictions in place. It's not universal, right? Some archives will take it and say, okay, well, we'll just note that this is a restriction. But I would say in general, archives are less interested in those types of recordings that have a lot of restrictions, because it's really, you're just becoming a repository for it, and you have to put in a lot of time and effort to care for it, but you can't share it. And the whole point of archives is to be able to share this information. So I think it's a personal decision.
I think it's personal, and I think also that gives credence to talking about why we have paperwork also, because if that archive does take that recording and the only thing you have is the person agreeing verbally to this interview and it's restricted, that paperwork, there's no paperwork. So how does someone know that's restricted? And in 10 years, that could accidentally get released against that person's wishes because everything was listened to again. So you really want to make sure you have paperwork to go with it, so they know it's restricted and it can remain restricted. So it's just a lot more effort and a lot more confusion to have restrictions, because we've had some that were restricted that we find and they're like, oh, this is a great interview. Oh, wait, we can't do anything with it.
And I think that's, this is just my comment, my 2 cents here, but I think that this and, getting people comfortable enough that they're willing to talk to you about personal details about their life and, put these in a form that the public can view, that's something that you really just kind of, you can't just walk up to somebody and say, I want to do your oral history. You've got to really do the work of getting to know that person or members of that community that you're wanting to talk to, and building the trust so that they will open up to you.
Absolutely.
And we just had another couple questions about what happens if you did an older oral history interview and you didn't get paperwork signed.
Yeah, so that's,
go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say that is where you run into a tricky situation with using it. If you have it and you're just listening to it in your house and your family's listening to it, that's different than giving it to an archive or including it in a website or something that you've created where you're sharing it with the world. I know that James in the chat talked a little bit about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's tricky. So I would suggest, if you do have an oral history interview and you want to do something with it and you don't have any paperwork, I would talk to a lawyer, somebody who specializes in copyright law and things like that before you do anything with it, just to kind of run down the situation and know the laws. There's a little bit of a gray area between when it comes to copyright law right now with oral histories specifically, because for so many years we were doing oral histories with tape recorders, or there's current digital recorders that you can use. This brave new world of video interviews that is just something that people have started doing in the past 10 years or so. There's a little bit of a gray area there on who the default owner of the recording is, which is what the default copyright owner of, is it the speaker, is it the person who's doing the recording? So that's why Jen and I were like, I always include it. We have one in our AHS, the oral history interview that we have when we conduct oral histories for the agency, that also, just includes the copyright statement. Just when in doubt, make sure it's in writing that they're passing the copyright to you. But yeah, and when in major doubt, lawyer up. Like find a lawyer who will look at the situation for you, because it really depends on the individual situation.
Yeah, and then we just had one other quick question about if I have old cassette tapes, VHS tapes, other types of magnetic media, is getting them digitized the best course of action for those? And I think all of the archivists on here will nod their heads and say, yes, absolutely. Cassette tapes, VHS tapes, anything of that nature, magnetic media, that is one of the fastest deteriorating mediums in the archives world. We have things from 1990 that are on VHS tape that nobody can play anymore because they're deteriorating so fast. So we would recommend that you look into getting those transferred. There's a lot of companies out there that'll do it. There's several, or at least one local person in both Tucson and the Phoenix area that'll do it. The gentleman who we have down here is really good. He's got certifications from various different, it's good to look for people who have certifications from professional organizations. That way you know that they're gonna handle your materials well and transfer them properly, and they can help guide you in that. And
also keep that original too. Like don't digitize it and then chunk the cassette, because something could happen to the file. And you know, you want to make sure you still keep the original until it's absolutely unusable, until it becomes trash itself. And then I saw a comment really quick about that there are some devices that you can use to do that. I think you were talking about doing that at home. Totally possible too, but just be careful, because the time that you play a tape or magnetic media to digitize it could be the last time it plays ever. And so just be careful and make sure you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna move into some questions about best practices while you're conducting an interview. So a question on if you're, well, let's see. I think I want to start with this question. Comment that a chronological outline of a person's life is always a good framework for an interview, i.e. starting when they were born and going up until where they are now when you're interviewing them. But is that the only way to conduct an oral history interview? When you are conducting an oral history interview, does it have to be about someone's entire life, or can it just be bits and pieces? What would you recommend?
It really depends on what you're using this for. If this is your family member and this is for your family, it depends on what the family wants to know. I mean, if you already know grandma's life for the last 10 years because you were part of it and you want to talk about her childhood, you could structure it so you're just talking about a certain chunk of time. You could structure it thematically. If you are really interested in grandma owned a particular business for 20 years and you want to know what it was like during that time frame, you could structure your questions about that time frame. It's really whatever you're planning to use this interview for. If you're interviewing a community member and you want to know something specific about the time that they served in the community, maybe they were, I don't even know, something to do with government, or just a person that gave to the community frequently and you want to talk about their philanthropy. It just depends on what you want to use it for and what you're looking to get out of it, because you're never, like I think we said too, you're never going to get that entire story in one sitting. So you could chunk it up. You could plan to spend an hour talking about one particular thing and then maybe go back to the family in a different interview. However, or whatever your purpose is, and that's why it's really important to figure that out before you get started. What do you want to do this for? It's not really necessarily an oral history interview if you're just going to sit down and chat and not really have a plan or a reason that you're doing this. Then it's more just an interview and a chit chat session. You kind of want this to be more structured.
Yeah, I like to think of oral history interviews too as kind of filling in some of the gaps that are not in the written record. So if you say you have a neighbor and you just know they have a fascinating life, that's where preparing and kind of doing your research and knowing, like, did they write a book already, or did they write a blog? Do they have a blog where they talk about their life, a certain aspect of their life? So that's already recorded. You could use your time and your interview as a chance to kind of get deeper than that, or to get a different aspect that's not recorded. So instead of kind of repeating the stuff that's already written down or that's already been recorded, I like oral histories for kind of supplementing. You can't really, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Jen, but you can't really write, a future historian is not likely going to write an entire history based on oral histories alone, because memory's fallible and because people curate their stories. We all have stories that we've told a million times and that have changed over the years until they become, like, I don't know, every year on my husband's birthday, his dad calls and tells him the story of the day he was born and where he was. And that, so it's a curated story. Who even knows if that's a true memory at this point, if that's the truth, what happened? So I think that, just kind of keeping that in mind and keeping in mind that it's not necessarily the truth that you're seeking, it's their perspective.
It's their view on this.
Unique view, yeah. Right.
I think you should tell real quick the story of the couple that you interviewed. Tell the story because you mentioned it earlier and I love this story.
Yes, okay, let me tell this story. So I interviewed a couple together, and this is the main reason why I warn people not to do interviews with more than one person at a time, because the whole time they were talking over one another. They would start, and then she got really upset at one point because it was a couple in their 70s. They had been married 50 years, and she got upset because he was veering into what she called gossipy territory. And so she said, in 1973, he said, in 1973, we were at the house of so-and-so. She was dating so-and-so at the time, but they weren't really serious. They were just kind of, hanging out. And she cut it off, and she asked me not to, she said, can you please turn off the recording? And then, chastised him for gossiping because his wife would not like that was on the record. And they also told me in this interview, they told me their story about how they met and how they had immigrated from Argentina to the US. And then the next year I was in Argentina, and I went to a oral history archive that they have down there that's all related to the dictatorship in Argentina. And she had an interview that she had done 20 years prior. And when I listened to that interview, let me tell y'all, her version of their love story or the way that they met was not as smooth or destined as they made it seem when they were together. And so that was she was gonna marry somebody else, and she was trying to weigh between the two of them. And so there was a whole nother story that she told in private in a one-on-one interview that she was not gonna tell in front of her spouse of 50 years. So it just taught me a very important lesson about the way that people change what they are, the way that they tell their stories based on who's listening. And that goes for the interviewer too. When I, approach people who I don't know, I have to take into account, who am I to go ask them to tell me their story, and why would they even trust me? Rachel talked on it a little bit, touched on it when you said about building trust and building that rapport. Sometimes you have to, if it's somebody you don't know or somebody who's skeptical about why you would want to hear their story, sometimes you have to put in a lot of work beforehand to build up to them letting you do an honest interview. So it's just, these are all things to keep in mind when you're prepping for the interview itself.
So another question kind of in that same vein is, are there any tips for how would you broach sensitive topics without alienating or angering the person that you're interviewing? And then if after you've done this interview, the interviewee decides that something that they told you, they really didn't want to tell you that, and they shouldn't have said that, how do you handle that? Can you redact things?
We'll take this one too, because I have experience with this. So I think that is why the pre-interview process is so important. It's important to be honest about what you want to talk about, and what kinds. You can send them the questions in advance if you want. I mean, you don't have to, but if they ask, send them the questions that you prepared in advance so that they're not caught unawares. But I think it depends on the person, right? So you might be speaking with someone who's like a veteran or something, and they say I don't want to talk about the war. Like, I want to talk about everything else in my life, but I don't want to talk about the war. And you need to respect that. Even if that's what you really, really wanted to hear about, you can talk to them beforehand, try to kind of smooth that down, and maybe if you have a good enough reason and can explain enough why you want to hear that particular part of their story, they might adjust and let you ask those kinds of questions. But when it comes to the after, if they absolutely, this is where the sticky situations arise, almost always based on how you take that interview and use it afterwards and people not liking it. So if you Google, like, I'm sorry, James, I'm not trying to scare everybody all the time, but if you Google like oral history conflicts, it's usually about, oh, I don't like the way that they quoted me in this book, or I don't like the way that their blog used my words. But that's why the paperwork is so important, because they are giving you the permission to do it. I did an interview with someone and I compromised because she was very hesitant to do an interview with me in the first place. And then afterwards, I sent her the transcript and she didn't like it. So I told her she didn't like the recording. So I compromised with her and I used the transcript. I used some of her words in my paper that I was writing, but I did not donate her interview when I donated the other ones that I had done to an archive. I just had to cut my losses with that, because the last thing you want is to offend the person that you respect enough to get their oral history interview, or that you not even respect, but you want to hear, that you think that what they have to say is important and you're giving them that platform. So it's kind of tricky, but
I think it comes down to that trust part at the beginning too. You just really have to establish that relationship. And if you feel like it's kind of tenuous and you're not sure if they really are into this, maybe you spend a little more time getting to know them before you turn on the recording. Maybe you just have more of the chat ahead of time. you know, maybe you're scheduled for tomorrow and you're having a chat today and you're not feeling like this is going well, maybe you postpone it and you come back tomorrow and have lunch with them, and then, you know, just make the relationship work.
Absolutely. I had to work for that one. And then I ended up not having the full thing that I wanted, but I had a signed consent form, and she agreed that I could take notes and use that in my paper, and she was not very happy. She sent me lots of corrections that she wanted me to make, and I was very clear from the beginning why I wanted the interview, what I was going to use it for, and that's why I had her sign that form. So people do have interview regret sometimes. I would say not most of the time. Most of the time people are gung-ho to do this. Like, they think it's very, they're flattered a lot of the time that you would think that they're important enough, you know, to be part of the historical record like this. So don't be afraid of it, but it does sometimes take some work.
Yeah, I love James. James, your comment is wonderful. Oral history has some parallels to dating, and you don't want it to end in divorce. That's exactly right.
All right, and I think that's a good note to end it on. We're just about at the end of our time. We thank you everyone for joining. I think we did our best to answer all the questions we got. If we didn't answer a question, or if you've got another burning question, feel free to email us. Our email address is right there on the screen, or you can look up Perri, Jen, Isabel, myself. We're all listed on the contact page. And again, feel free to reach out. We're happy to help with any other questions and anything else we can.
Yeah,
It's nice talking to you all. I can talk about this for hours, so give me a call or send me an email if you have any follow-up questions, and I will work hard on that handout that will go up on our digital hub.
It was great. And if you guys have any thoughts about other workshops you'd like to see us do, shoot an email over and we will see what we can do.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.